So we had put out a call to your office, said, hey, if you're in the region, we'd love to sit down with you. What brings you to the region?
Well, I was here for a couple of reasons. One, I was over in Jaffrey at Graphic Cast, where they make, as he said, they're a job shop. They make precision parts for companies, and they have, their CEO has been very outspoken about his concern about what tariffs will mean and a trade war and how that would affect their business. So I wanted to talk to him about that and express my concern about tariffs and the potential for a trade war here. I don't think that's good for America. I certainly don't think it's good for New Hampshire. So that was my first event, and got a tour of Graphic Cast and the process. Had a chance to see what they do and talk to some of their employees. And then I had lunch with the interim president of Keene State College, Melissa Treadwell. She's very impressive. We had a good conversation. She brought me up to date about some of the work that she's been doing there and changes at the college. And then I just came from a meeting with county officials, county and economic development officials, talking about our interest in adding Cheshire County to the Northern Border Regional Commission, which, as you may know, was created in 2008 to try and help distressed communities along the northern border, what originally I think was identified as northern forest lands. And because those forests, there's been an impact to the economy in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and upper New York State from the timber economy. It's an effort to provide some economic development support to those communities. And in New Hampshire, we currently have Sullivan, Grafton, Coos, and Carroll counties that are part of the Northern Border Regional Commission and eligible for those grants. But it's been brought to our attention by folks in Cheshire County that Cheshire actually could qualify under the demographic and economic criteria that is required for the MBRC. So I wanted to talk to them about their interest in the commission and the potential for funding through that and the kinds of initiatives that they think might be appropriate for Cheshire County.
So is that an indication that they feel conditions here are economically are worsening, or is it simply there's a pool of money that they'd like to have access to?
Well, I think it's a recognition that if you look at the demographic information, that Cheshire County fits within the framework of the counties that qualify to be part of the Northern Border Regional Commission and qualify for that funding. So,
is that a new development, or?
I think it's been a development that's been happening over the last decade or so. But if you look at things like poverty rate, at migration rate, at aging population, Cheshire County qualifies. And I'm sure Tim from the Southern Region Planning Commission, Murphy, yes, Tim had some very compelling statistics that showed why Cheshire County qualifies, that if you all haven't seen, it would be interesting for you to take a look at.
So when I talked on the phone briefly and by email with the other Sarah down in Washington, she mentioned that one of the issues you wanted to explore is the opioid crisis and what is or ought to be happening with funding from Washington. You'd like to?
Well, it's something that I've been working on, as has the rest of the delegation, as I'm sure all of you know who are covering what's going on here. New Hampshire has been very hard hit. I don't have to tell any of you that. We have the third highest overdose rate in the country, the highest percent of overdose deaths from fentanyl. And we have been working for the last, really since 2015, 2014, to try and figure out how we can provide some more resources for communities that are really fighting to address this crisis. And we just got in the budget bill $3.3 billion for 2018 and another $3 billion for 2019 to address the opioid epidemic. And what I'm working on now is trying to figure out how we can make sure that those dollars go for what's most effective in addressing the opioid epidemic, and also to make sure that New Hampshire gets our fair share of those dollars. What we tried to do in 2016, we passed $1 billion for something called the 21st Century Cures Act. $500 million of that was for 2017, $500 million for 2018. The language in that legislation said that those dollars are supposed to go more to those states that have been hardest hit. So New Hampshire would have been on that list. Unfortunately, as the administration distributed the dollars, they decided to do it based mostly on population. So New Hampshire got a very small percentage of the dollars, and we've been trying to reverse that, to take a look at the formula. The funding that just got passed provides for a set aside of $142 million to go to the hardest hit states. So a lot of the money will go through something called the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, which has programs set up to help with everything from treatment to recovery to law enforcement. A lot of it will go through SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. But we set aside this little pot of $142 million that's designed to go to the hardest hit states. So in addition to all the other funding that's there, this is supposed to be directed strictly at the states that are hardest hit. The way it's written, the administration is supposed to decide how that money's distributed. So one of the things we're working on is trying to encourage the administration to look at states like New Hampshire that are very hard hit and look at how to target that money so that it goes to the states that are most in need. So you have West Virginia, for example, which is number one. West Virginia also has a pretty small population, a little bigger than New Hampshire, but very small. And so they have a huge problem, and they also have not gotten the resources that they need. So we're trying to say, look at those of us who are really hit by this problem, that are doing some really good things. We've got some really effective efforts going on in New Hampshire. Let's fund those, and let's make sure that states like New Hampshire and West Virginia and some of the other states that are hardest hit get the dollars that we need to make sure these programs can work.
Senator, I have a follow-up question to that. So you mentioned the $142 million and setting it aside for the hardest hit states. How much of that money do you think should go to New Hampshire?
Well, my preference would be to say let's target that to the 5 hardest hit states. And let's think about what we've proposed is a floor for those states of no less than $10 million coming to us, and then doing some sort of a sliding scale where the funding is distributed based on overdose mortality rates as opposed to population.
So at least $10 million,
Right.
But more based on opioid, on overdose deaths.
Right. And that would be in addition to whatever else is available to distribute through the other sources. But this would be a separate fund that would be available.
Another follow-up question, you mentioned that the funds would be distributed among prevention and law enforcement and treatment. So how much money do you think should go to each of these, or what percentage should go to each of these 3 sort of important pieces of the puzzle?
Well, treatment obviously is the biggest piece, and what has made the most difference in terms of treatment has been the expansion of Medicaid here in New Hampshire. So, the bipartisan legislation that was passed by Governor Hassan and the Republican legislature that has been continued by the Republican legislature, they're still working out some of the details, and the Governor Sununu. That has made the biggest difference, because it means now people who were not able to get treatment can get treatment. And what we've seen in a lot of those cases is that people are able to get treatment, rebuild their lives, and then go on private insurance. So what we're seeing is people going off the Medicaid program into private insurance, and that's what we really want. So that's the most important, and that's where, if you look at the money in the Affordable Care Act that helps fund the expansion of Medicaid, that's where the biggest pot of money is. Some other areas where there has been less funding, but where I think we need to increase the amount, I don't have a magic number for what that should be, but is prevention, for one thing, because we know if we can keep people from becoming a substance abuser, then that's the cheapest thing we can do and the best thing for that individual and their family. And whether that's because somebody gets a substance use disorder from opioids because they've been prescribed it for an injury or whatever, and changing that trajectory so that we understand better what the implications are of prescribing is very important, or whether we can keep somebody from using just because they've gone to a party and they're getting pressure from their peers. I was at Sanborn High School last week, and I was talking to some of the students. They have a very good program there that they've been working with young people on prevention, and I was asking some of the students who were there if they knew anybody who used drugs, how that happened, and most of them said, you know, it's because of peer pressure. Kids go to a party, somebody there is using drugs, they feel like they're happy, and they're going to do it too. So making sure that young people understand what the ramifications are of taking that step is really important. So I think increasing funding for prevention is critical. Also looking at recovery. One of the things that I've learned about substance use disorder is that it's a chronic illness, and we need to treat it like a chronic illness. It's not a moral failing, it's an illness. And just as somebody with diabetes and heart disease is going to need help over an extended period of time, someone with a substance use disorder is as well. And so making sure that there's support for recovery is very important. And then, of course, things like drug courts and forensic identification of what drugs were used, things like law enforcement, our high-intensity drug trafficking zones, making sure that they continue to get funded, all of that is critical.
So if I hear you correctly, you're saying treatment sort of is the biggest priority, followed by prevention, followed by law enforcement, correct?
Well, I think treatment is up there at number one. I would sort of lump the rest of the things very much together in terms of thinking about how we fund them. And some programs are more effective than others, so we know there are some things that work better than others, and we ought to be supporting what works. And if we don't have data that show what we're doing works, then we need to look at other things that do work.
So one last question on this, and I'll let the rest of you guys talk. So President Trump spoke in Manchester about the opioid crisis and sort of his vision, and he spoke a lot about law enforcement. And so where do you feel that fits in, the supply sort of side of it, like in the hierarchy that you sort of described?
Well, law enforcement is very important. What we don't want is people dealing drugs. We don't want drugs coming up from the southern part of the country, and making sure that we can fund those law enforcement efforts is really important. That's why I mentioned the high-intensity drug trafficking zones. We have 2 of them now in southern Hillsborough and southern Rockingham counties, and they work across the border with Massachusetts. And they've been very effective at interdicting drugs. Unfortunately, when the president put forward his budget, he proposed zeroing out that program. Mm-hmm. The president's rhetoric has often not been in alignment with what he's proposed in his budget and in funding, and that's disappointing. But I think law enforcement is very important. And I think we should feel good about law enforcement in New Hampshire, because what they have recognized is that this is a chronic disease. And I can't tell you how many police chiefs I've heard say, we're not going to jail our way out of this problem. We need to understand that people have to get into treatment. And, you know, in the city of Laconia, for example, they have one police officer who's dedicated just to trying to help people get into treatment, who he's identified with substance use disorders, and helping their family understand how to get people into treatment.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So you also, I think, plan to talk a little bit about some of the budgeting priorities in the spending bill that was passed recently. One of those was elections security. Is this money meant for states' use versus federal elections?
A significant amount is meant for states to be able to ensure that their election systems are secure, so that we have where they're using voting machines, so that we know that those voting machines are up to date, that you can't hack into them, that there is a paper trail that can be followed. You know, I know that the Russians attempted to influence our elections in 2016, and they were very successful at it. Through a disinformation campaign, they hacked into 22 states' election systems in some way. I think we've heard from Mike Pompeo as director of the CIA, and from Dan Coates, the director of the National Security Advisor. We've heard from multiple federal officials in the Trump administration who have said the Russians are continuing to meddle in our elections. They are continuing to meddle into the 2018 elections. And we need to be prepared for that. And right now we're not doing enough. So that's why I think it's very important to make sure we have secure election systems. That, you know, as I said, that we're looking at the hardware that exists, the voting machines, that we're looking at some sort of a paper trail, that we're looking at other ways in which those systems could be manipulated.
So a lot of, obviously a lot of elections work is done at the state levels and
Right.
local levels.
That's why that
when you
funding
get
is available.
to November, what can or should the federal government be doing to address the threat of continuing interference?
Well, trying to make funding available to help states, which is what the budget bill did, so that states who may not be convinced or may not have the funding in their budgets to help ensure the security of their election systems. That's one thing. Also provide training. One of the things that the Department of Homeland Security did before the 2016 elections was to try and get attention by election officials in states to make them aware of what the threat is and what information they could provide to help with training to make sure that states were addressing that. So I think that's a very important role that the federal government can play.
Okay. And when you mentioned having paper trail for machine counted ballots, obviously the ballots are still there.
Right.
They've been accepting machines where touch screens.
Yes, well, some machines don't have a paper trail.
Right.
So that's part of the concern.
Okay.
That's not a problem that we have in New Hampshire.
I think most New Hampshire machine counted machines that count ballots
Have a paper trail.
Have the actual ballots coming through.
Right.
I guess that's a paper trail in itself.
Yes, that is. But as I said, there are states that don't have that, and voting precincts that don't have that. They have voting machines, but no paper backup to show how people voted.
Switching gears over to Veterans Affairs, and specifically Secretary Shulkin, Do you think his dismissal was the right thing to do? Do you think a change was needed, or do you think that he was heading in the right direction in his policies while he was in office?
I didn't always agree with Secretary Shulkin, but I think he understands the VA. He had been at the VA for long enough to know how it operates. He was making some changes in a way that were positive. I think his handling of the crisis that we had here in New Hampshire, I approved of. I thought he came in, he made changes immediately after he heard the situation and set up a task force, brought in new leadership, and I think all of that has been very positive. So I also think he opposes, while he supports the choice program and understands the importance of providing options for veterans in communities where they can't get access to care, so in New Hampshire where we don't have a full-service veterans hospital, where many of our veterans have had to travel for very long distances to get care. The idea that there is in the private sector the ability to get care for those veterans through the choice program has been very important, and the changes that he understood needed to continue to happen to make that program work. I think all of that was very positive, and I think he doesn't support privatizing the VA, which I approve of. I don't think we should privatize the VA, and if you talk to veterans, they certainly don't believe you should privatize the VA. I think that's, at least if reports are to be believed, that's one of the reasons that he was dismissed by the president.
Well, as a follow-up, what is the litmus test for Dr. Jackson to get your vote? Well, what does he need to demonstrate to?
I want to know what kind of management experience he's got. The VA is the second largest agency within the federal government. I want to know how he's going to manage that. I want to know how he feels about privatization and how he thinks we should address some of the challenges at the VA. So I think there are a lot of questions that he needs to answer in order for him to be approved from my perspective.
And switching gears again, what do you think the role of Congress is in making real change to help with the treatment of women in the workplace?
Well, one thing that would make a huge difference would be comparable wages for comparable work. I think an equal pay legislation would be very important, because if women are viewed as equal in the workplace, that will go a long way to address some of the other issues that are out there. I think some of the cultural challenges that we still face as women in the United States and around the world are harder to legislate, but making sure that equal opportunity is available for women is very important. So that things like making sure that women can fill all positions within our military, for example. I think that's an important step forward.
What steps do you think can be done sooner rather than later? Because change always takes time, but what can be done sort of more rapidly?
Well, again, equal pay for equal work would be a very important change that could be done very quickly. I've addressed issues around sexual assault. I've sponsored legislation to pass a sexual assault survivors' Bill of Rights that is now a model for states around the country, and we're beginning to see states adopt that provide for certain protections for people who are victims of sexual assault. So making sure that they know what's happening with the rape kits, for example, and that they can't be destroyed unless the person who is the survivor is notified, making sure that they know what is going to happen, that they have access to services. All of that should be required for any victims of sexual assault. So those are changes that we can make, legal changes that we can make that ensure that women are treated equally. Again, we're probably not going to stop some of the abuses, but we can make sure that there are consequences for those abuses.
Do you feel that over the past year, the attention that this has gotten, you've had colleagues who have had to step down because of sexual harassment and abuse allegations, and others who have come under fire. And the same has happened in the entertainment industry, and a lot of well-known people. So this has really been something that's gathered steam in the public sphere. Do you think that this is that there's a momentum there that's going to eventually go away, or is it going to build? Is this a turning point, or is this just, okay, there's public awareness right now, and then something else will come along and it will lose some steam?
I hope it's a turning point. I hope that women feel empowered to speak up. And we've seen that, with my colleagues. We had one instance in the Senate, which I have not talked about because I'm on the Ethics Committee and I'm prohibited from doing that with respect to Senator Franken. But I think it's important for women to speak up and for us to recognize that what has happened is not okay. It's not acceptable. When I first got elected to the state Senate back in 1990, there was a requirement that everyone in the legislature had to take sexual harassment training. That went away. Now that's come back, and there's a recognition that this probably needs to be something that's ongoing. But I have 3 daughters, I have 3 granddaughters. I think we need to make sure that women understand what their rights are and that they are empowered, that they should not have to be subject to sexual harassment and sexual assault in the workplace or anywhere else.
You mentioned the training, and that's a step that has been reinstituted.
Right.
Does more need to be done within Congress itself, and in how staff are treated or viewed? Because there's certainly an inequity there in power between a lawmaker and people on their staff.
There is. I think transparency is an important way to deal with it, and making sure that, as the House has done, that if someone reaches a settlement agreement with someone who has been harassed or assaulted, that that's public information, and that any financial agreement comes from the offender's pocket as opposed to from taxpayer dollars. I mean, it's a difficult conversation because we have a president who's being accused of all of these offenses and has not been willing to acknowledge or has continued to deny any wrongdoing. So I think that makes the discussion more difficult.
How do you balance the presumption of innocence when accusations are made with taking as seriously as need be the voice of people who say they were harassed or abused?
Well, I think in the Senate, we're not in a position of having to do that, But if somebody came into my workplace, in my office, and accused another person in the office of improper wrongdoing, we would take action. There is an employee assistance program where we can refer people. We can bring people in to investigate and hold people accountable if they're found to be in violation of the rules. And that's important. We need to do that, and we need to be transparent about it.
So, a different topic. I met you here in January when we talked with a group of business owners from the telecom industry
About
net neutrality.
Right.
And I'm wondering what you've done sort of since then on rural broadband and access, and
Well, that's a different issue than net neutrality.
but you kind of touched on that.
We
About like
did
particularly
because-
how it affects the rural communities.
Right, because it's often a bigger issue in rural communities because there are fewer providers, internet service providers. And one of the things that we included in the budget bill was additional funding for broadband. It's not yet clear how that's going to be distributed, and so we're trying to work on that to make sure that communities in New Hampshire who may qualify know that. On the net neutrality piece, we're continuing to do whatever we can to try and overturn the FCC ruling, which the regulatory process starts April 23rd, and then sometime in midsummer, we will have a vote on the Congressional Review Act. And if we can convince one more person in the Senate, then we can overturn the FCC ruling on net neutrality. And as we said at that roundtable, one of the reasons this is such a big issue for us in New Hampshire is because of our rural areas and because we have so many small businesses. And I think it's a huge issue for people everywhere. In fact, I can tell you, I don't have today's number, but as of sometime last week, we had heard from 26,430, I think, or so people in support of net neutrality. And we'd heard from 0 people in opposition. So 0 people in New Hampshire supporting what the FCC did in terms of saying they were going to start regulating the internet so that it might not be equally accessible to consumers and businesses in the country. And that's a huge challenge for consumers, for business. I was at as I said, I had lunch with Interim President Treadwell earlier, and we were talking about this, about the potential impact on universities and in terms of information flow. So I think it's a very big problem, and I'm hoping that we can overturn what the FCC has done. And access to broadband in rural communities is also a continuing challenge. When I was meeting with folks earlier about the Northern Border Regional Commission, one of the things they were talking about is the challenge in this part of the state with access to high-speed internet and broadband, and that is still a challenge. You know, we were working on that when I was governor 20 years ago.
You mentioned additional funding for broadband. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
I need to get back to you on that because one of the things we're trying to do is to figure out exactly how that's going to be distributed. And I don't know the answer to that.
In terms of states or
Yeah, in terms of,
direction?
it will be, I think it will be available through grants, but whether the grants will be for middle mile, for it will be for the last distance, whether it will be for particular commercial or, you know, nonprofit enterprises, I don't know the answer to that, so we need to get back to you on that.
To really switch gears, as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, you probably have some particular insight on this. The President recently talked about getting out of Syria real soon. Can we leave Syria soon?
That was a surprise. I think it was a surprise to those of us who had been following what's happening in Syria. I think it was a surprise to our military leaders that he said that, because just a month or so ago we had then Secretary of State Tillerson saying that we were going to continue in Syria after the fall of ISIS. I think it's very difficult for us to get out at this point, and also to telegraph that we're going to get out and when. One of the things that happened in Iraq is we pulled our troops out, and what we saw was a metamorphosis from Al-Qaeda to ISIS, because they just moved in a different direction and changed their name and became a different and in many ways even more challenging terrorist group. I don't want that to happen in Syria.
Is that the biggest worry, that a group like that will form, or is it also essentially turning over the country to Assad and
Well, there are a lot
Russia and Iran and
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many different factions going on there.
There are, and that's the other challenge with leaving entirely, is that it would leave Syria and the potential for Iran and Russia to use Syria as a base of operations to expand across the Middle East. We're seeing Iran do that anyway. So I think there are a lot of reasons why what the president said doesn't make sense, and there doesn't seem to be a strategy within which he talked about that. It certainly belies what he had said earlier about not telegraphing when we're going to leave to our enemies. So I think there are a lot of questions about what he's really saying there. And it's not something that I think makes sense in the context in which he said it.
Different topic. Where do we stand now on DACA? There was the March 5th deadline. It was kind of missed.
Well, it was missed because the court has ruled that that the president can't deport people. So as long as the courts have weighed in, it's going to be harder to get Congress to act. I support the DREAM Act. I think I'm a co-sponsor of that. I supported the DACA compromise that came out of what we call the Common Sense Coalition of Republicans and Democrats that worked to try and get an agreement. And we got 54 votes for our agreement. We got more votes than any other. But at this point, I think it will be hard to get something done as long as the courts have stayed the deportation and as long as the president continues to refuse to work with Congress to come up with an agreement.
In the past, you said your top priority is securing the border.
Yeah, let me just back up a little bit on DACA, because the other thing that I think is very important to point out is we've got, depending upon how you define DACA and what date you use for when people came into the country, we've got between 700,000 and 1.3 million. I think the agreement that we came to with the Common Sense Coalition was about 1.3 million young people who have been working, who many of them have gone to college, they're in the military, they have been contributing to America. They want to stay here. They want to become productive citizens. It's in all of our interests to do that. One of the things they just said to me when I was at the county meeting was the challenge that businesses in Cheshire County have with getting workers. We are creating more jobs than we're producing workers to fill. And the idea that we would send back 1 million people who want to live and work in America just doesn't make any sense for all kinds of reasons. So it's in everybody's interest to get this done in a way that allows those young people to stay in this country.
So my understanding is that you're saying that the Dreamers could potentially come here and sort of fill jobs that are open?
Well, the Dreamers, we have about 400 Dreamers in New Hampshire. And what I'm saying is that we've got all kinds of jobs in the country. Many of them, most of them, have been working, or they've been going to school, or they've been in the military. They've been doing productive endeavors. And for us to suddenly say, oh no, sorry, we're going to send you back to a country you may never have known, because most of them came to America when they were too young to know any other country. It's not in our national interest.
Thank you. So I asked the question and then went at DACA, but I wanted to kind of circle back to it. So you mentioned before your priority was to secure the border, and so I'm wondering where we stand with that now. Do you support Trump's sort of idea of the wall?
I don't support the wall. I do think border security is very important. For 2 years, I was the ranking member of the Homeland Security Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee that is responsible for border security. I had a chance to visit the southern border and see and hear from our CBP agents, Customs and Border Patrol agents, and other people along the border about what was important to address illegal entry into the United States. And everybody I talked to talked about the importance of electronic monitoring, about some of the sophisticated technology that allows us to view people coming across the border as being the most important way to address illegal immigration. The other thing that I think it's important to point out for people is that we have a lot of fencing along our border to try and address illegal immigration. In places where that's there, it's been fairly successful. There are a lot of places where we haven't put fencing up because there are environmental or private property objections to do that, which are not going to go away if you try and build a fence. They're probably going to get exacerbated.
But I'm going to put up a fence doesn't make for much of a campaign slogan. Is from a pragmatic.
I'm not worried about what Trump's campaign slogan is.
From a pragmatic standpoint on immigration, is it worth at some point giving him something that he can say,
Hey, listen.
I got a wall built in order to
The
achieve
Democrats
your
and
goals?
Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer went to the White House and said, we'll give you your border wall if you give us an agreement on DACA. He said, great, I'm all for that. That was Tuesday. On Thursday, he reneged. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to support his border wall unless he's going to tell me something that he's going to do that's going to be really important to address the illegal immigration issue.
It's interesting you bring up that turnabout which is sounds very similar to his stance on the NRA and gun
Absolutely.
control recently. We've asked you this before, but your thoughts on responsible gun control versus what you think can or ought to be done federally?
Well, let me begin by pointing out that after Newtown, I voted for the comprehensive background check legislation. I voted for a limitation on the size of magazines, and I voted for an assault weapons ban. And I voted for virtually every other piece of legislation that has been in the Senate to address reduction in gun violence. I think one of the things that has happened because of the Parkland shooting that's very positive is we got 2 provisions in the budget bill to address gun violence. One is a change to our comprehensive background check, the NICS system, that is very positive because that's a system that had a lot of holes in it. The other thing that was included is a repeal of something called the Dickey Amendment, which was passed to prohibit the Centers for Disease Control from doing research into the causes of gun violence. Neither of those things would have gotten done without those young people marching. And so I do think we're seeing not a response that goes as far as I think we should to address gun violence, but a response that I think is important as we look at how do we get Congress to move to address this issue. You know, the information that I've seen that shows the most important piece of addressing gun violence is the comprehensive background check legislation that would close loopholes that exist in our system. And we got very close to passing that in 2013 after the Newtown shooting. I think we had 56 or 57 votes. We were short of the 60 vote. margin, but that was bipartisan legislation that almost passed. And if we could do that, that would go a very long way towards beginning to address what we've seen in terms of shootings, not just in schools, but in workplaces and too many other places in this country.
Got about 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Keeping with that for a second, so I'm sure you're aware of the recent votes in Vermont regarding gun control.
I don't know the particulars.
Oh, okay. Well, never mind. I won't get into that. In talking about the opioid issue earlier, you brought up the expanded Medicaid, which is part of the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
I'm wondering, at this point, with what this administration and I guess to a lesser extent some of the things that were in the GOP tax plan have done
Like the
to
repeal of the individual mandate.
Yeah. What is needed at this point to ensure accessible, affordable health care? Is
A new president?
Is that still?
A new administration? I mean, I'm only half joking.
Yeah.
I think as long as we continue to see this president and the control of Congress the way it is, there will be continued efforts to undermine the Affordable Care Act. And they've done a very successful job at that, as we saw. And despite those efforts to reduce the marketing of the Affordable Care Act before the sign up for this year, we still had almost the same number of people as in 2017. It was about 400,000 less, and New Hampshire was about 40,000 fewer who signed up, despite the dramatically reduced time frame in which people could sign up, despite the dramatic reduction in the marketing that was available to let people know about it. So we're going to continue to see those kinds of efforts by this administration to undermine the law. And we know this is something that this is like the number one priority for people everywhere, jobs and health care. If you look at the impact in some of the special elections that we've seen, voters cite this as the number one concern in the way they voted. And yet we're seeing this administration reduce the payments that have gone to insurance companies to provide for help for people who need help with the cost of coverage of insurance. Those CSR payments, they're called, the cost saving reduction payments. They've eliminated those in a way that has forced premiums up on insurance for Americans across the country. I had a chance to talk to the woman who was the head of the Association of Health Insurance Plans before she left, who said that that's driven up the rates for insurance premiums by about 20% nationwide. There are places where it's totally driven private insurers out of the market. We had legislation that included reinstating those CSR payments, that included reinsurance, which would have made a huge difference in states across this country. And the Republicans killed it, so it wasn't included in the budget bill. So there is no doubt, for whatever reason, I don't understand it, that the Republicans who are in control in Congress now and the president are going to do everything they can to try and undermine people's health insurance. And I think it's one of the number one concerns that people have, as I said. When Senator Hassan and I were trying to hear from people in New Hampshire about their concerns before the vote on the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, on about 48 hours' notice, we packed rooms in Concord, and we had an overflow. We had several hundred people there coming to tell their stories, because health care is so important to them, and health insurance. So I think until we see a change either in control of Congress, the House, the Senate, or in the President, we're going to continue to see these efforts to undermine health care in a way that is very detrimental to the people of New Hampshire and the people of this country.
Okay. How'd we do?
Great.
We got out.
Right on the button.
Good.
All right.
Thanks.